Hi, this is Neil Buchanan with Rock Our World. I have a whole bunch of little things to clear up today, and the more urgent thing I want to cover as best I can is the count uh, towards the Feast of Weeks, because it's coming closer. The full count of counting 7 weeks, and then the day after is the day of the Feast of Weeks, and in our good old New Testament that was mistranslated into Greek, they came up with the word Pentecost, which means count 50. No, God never called it that ever. That was a made-up name, a bogus name that the translators came up with. They changed a whole pile of stuff. In fact, some episode I'm going to take my the Aramaic New Testament, Aramaic English New Testament, and just pick a passage out of one of the books and read it in Aramaic, what was written in Aramaic, and then read what was mistranslated in English into Greek, and then of course into English and other languages, and show you how completely immoral and dishonest they were in doing the translation, because the Torah is fully supported in the New Testament, and the Greek translation they came up with left it out in question in lots of ways. So anyway, that's a future episode. But anyway, I should cover this first, this counting of the 7 weeks. And if you go back, I think it probably was the last episode, I talked somewhat about how the count goes. No, it was a few episodes back. How the Lord tells us to count 7 weeks after the harvest has begun. And I'm going to have to assume it began on the first Sabbath after the days of unleavened bread. I would have to live in Israel or get a real good report from somebody. I'd asked Nehemiah Gordon to phone me, but he hasn't. And he would be a good logical guy, because he already understands that you understand things by reading the scriptures and then having God reveal them to you. You don't understand things by listening to the rabbis or the Christian teachers, authors, and so on, because they all just learned it from the people before them, who learned it from the people from before them, and who inherited lies from our fathers. And that's the scripture. I'll have to look it up one of these days. But anyway, you can look it up with all our modern tech, word search programs, software, and there's all kinds of them out there, and they're very effective. Put in some keywords and they'll bring up all the possibilities in the Bible, in the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and the inspired commentary. Anyway, all those guys out there learning, getting their noses in the scriptures, make sure you use these tools, and you will learn the scriptures very quickly. So anyway, back to the count. You count. You have the wave sheaf offering on the Sabbath that follows the week the farmers started to harvest. And as I pointed out, farmers know when to harvest the barley. They're not going to put it in their storage barns. We call them granaries up here, but in the scriptures you would see storehouses. But it's a granary. You throw the grain in. You're not going to put it in there until it's dry enough, or it'll spoil. Farmers know when that is, so you wait for them to start the harvest. They're not going to take a chance of having their harvest spoil. So the Lord says on that particular week, when they start harvest, you don't eat any of that grain until you perform this important ceremony, the wave sheaf offering. You take, I believe it was 2 sheaves of the grain as it's being harvested, like you haven't knocked the grain out of the heads yet. Take these 2 bunches and wave them before the Lord, and that is the signal of the beginning of the count to the Feast of Weeks. So the very next day begins that count. After that Sabbath day, you count 7 complete Sabbath cycles. And the word the word that the Lord uses there, and this is going to Leviticus, and there's other details in many other places, one in Deuteronomy, but the main one is Leviticus. We read it yesterday, and the four of us have been that meet for a Sabbath meeting, a home church. We read through the Torah portions, and that's all man-made, but there's nothing wrong with reading the scriptures. Just make sure you read all the scriptures, not just the Torah and not just the New Testament, not just the Psalms or Proverbs, not just, just pick on one thing and read it. You read all of it. And that goes for the Christian people and the Jewish people. I'm sure they're both just as bad. The Jewish people go through the Torah portion, so they know the Torah. But if that's all they ever do, they've never read the writings nor the prophets. And many Christians have never read anything but what we call the New Testament, or they do, and it's all mistranslated anyway. So although if you read it very carefully, there's still plenty of question aroused. For instance, when Yeshua said in Matthew 5:14, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it." Now we can twist that up any way you want, but at the end of the story, Yeshua did not come to destroy the law. That's what he said. Anyway, once you get yourselves a ain't, which is a poor translation in my opinion, because they have so many Hebrewized words in it, that's not necessary. We're English. It just made me think of this. This is just off to one of those words that the Messianics love to throw around, are the tzitzit. That it's not a tzitzit. If you're Hebrew, it would be. In English, it's a tassel. And that's one of the instructions the Lord has been bugging me about. I've worn my tassels the odd time, the odd part of my walk, and I need to be doing it all the time. I'll give you a testimony. The first time I did it, its purpose is to remind us to keep all of God's instructions, the whole works of them, not just for Christians. We keep 10, 15. For the Jewish people, they keep about 20,000 of them, whereas God only made 613. Let's go with the Jewish concept and idea that there's exactly 613 separate instructions within the Torah. I have no problem with that. I say it's about 600, and if the Lord points out something you're missing and you need to be doing it, just like wearing my tassels, I'm supposed to be doing that, and I'll get there. So now, where was it? The count of the 7 weeks. Now, in this count, we were going over this in Leviticus 23 yesterday, and I talked a little bit about the count of the 7 weeks between the waving of the sheaf at the beginning of the harvest, the Sabbath that follows the beginning of harvest. And I was asked the question by Roberta, why do you not count the New Moon Festival? And I came up with an answer. My first step is, and the Lord taught me these things, so kind of go back on how he did, but he reminded me constantly that his thoughts are not my thoughts, his ways are not my ways. So don't assume that because of our paradigms, our way of thinking, and we've been trained in the ways of Babylon, that then we would be thinking correctly. For instance, a day is not 24 hours. Most days are from sunset to sunset, which is never 24 hours, but other days are from the first sign to the last sign, and quite often the first sign is sunset. That's when all days begin and end. But some days in God's sight are actually what we would call 2 days, because the second sign tarries. For instance, if the new moon, I didn't finish this thought earlier either, the new moon can either be 1 day or 2 days. And it's possible it can be 3, but I haven't seen that yet. And if it ever happens, I'll report it. But I suspect what I was running into is when we come to the spot when we're on the international date line, and you on that particular, if you're on that spot on Earth when the first quarter of the moon shows itself on the first Sabbath day of the new moon month cycle, you look up there and see that perfect quarter. That's what you're looking for all the time. But every once in a while you look up there and you look at it and say it's a bit short of being the seventh day. It's still not quite exactly a half, but you're thinking tomorrow it's going to be a little over. And sure enough, the next day it's about as much over as it was short the day before. Well, that means you're sitting on the international date line. If you drove yourself 1,000 miles one direction, it would be one day, and if you drove yourself 1,000 miles the other day, it would be the other day. And in fact, you get to pick. You're just part of a community, and a believing community, and you look up in the sky for the signs, and you see that moon you're not quite decided, you pick. But if it's already a 2-day new moon, no, how would this go? No, scratch that idea about the new moon, because you're at the first quarter. So what you're going to do is pick one or the other, but you know that you're on the international date line. So that that spot for the next 4 weeks, this wedge of the planet Earth is where the international date line is for that month. Not Greenwich or Greenwich. That's part of Babylon. Now, did I finish my thought? Okay, the new moon can be either 1 day or 2 days. And an example of 2 days is found in the chapter 20 of 1 Samuel, where the whole story happens over a 2-day new moon. And go to the New American Standard Version and to the JPS for the correct translation. A lot of translations, they talk about the first day of the month and the second day of the month, but in those two versions it says the first day of the new moon and the second day of the new moon. And in fact, it's quite obvious the whole story is about the new moon, is over the new moon festival, which lasts 2 days. And God still calls that a day, even though it was 2 days long. So back to our thoughts aren't his thoughts. His ways aren't our ways. Nonetheless, carry on with this. And there's another variable in the counting. Now, that's the moon cycle, which tells us when the Sabbath cycles are. That is the 6 working days plus the 7th day makes a full, complete week. An idiom that God uses when he says a week, he means that unit of time, which is 6 working days plus 1 Sabbath to end it. The 7th day being an idiom for the Sabbath day. But the new moon festival, the idiom is the 8th day. It doesn't fit in that week. It's set aside as something separate. And it also looks forward to the new heavens and the new earth, which is separate from the 70,000-year plan that God developed and created. Probably billions of years ago, he came up with the concept of the idea how to enlarge his family. I'm just talking here, right? God's a trillion times smarter than us, so we're trying to imagine how God thinks, whereas be kind of like a bug looking at the ocean, trying to figure out how it all works, and thinking he's real smart. Well, the bug looking at the ocean is never going to figure out how the ocean works. So we're the bug, and God's the ocean, and we can do some speculating and act like we're intelligent and smart, but compared to God, we're a bug looking at the ocean. And so back to the 8th day is not counted in a lot of ways. It's something set aside. It's something separate. So when we're counting the 7 weeks between the end of harvest, that Sabbath is kind of the beginning point, so that God says the very next day, which is the first day of the work week, unless some years it will be a new moon festival, so you don't count the new moon festival ever. So anyway, the first day of the week you start your count, and the week means 7 days, so every unit of 6 working days and a Sabbath constitute one of those 7 weeks. You count 7 of them, but in that count you're going to encounter 2 new moon festival situations. This year is unusual, not unusual. I mean, there's several configurations of where those 2 moons are going to fit in that 7 weeks. In this particular year, the first one just happened. Right now, yesterday, we celebrated the first Sabbath in the new month cycle. We saw the first quarter show itself quite beautifully in the sky, a nice clear day, and it happens to be Saturday, which is just a coincidence. It matches the Jewish traditional Sabbath, because the real Sabbath can happen any day of the Babylonian week. Remember, we're working 2 different systems. Our minds are immersed in Babylon, but God is pulling us out of Babylon. He's teaching us His ways, and when we are fully ready and the plan has come to fruition, then He will return. And I've predicted that we got a 50-year window here, and 40 of those years are going to be in the wilderness, wandering in the wilderness. So we got a 10-year window here. Things are going to go south really fast for 10 years. By the year 5, I predict our banks won't be functioning. We will stop being able to use cash because it's meaningless. Gold will be useless, and we'll be strictly to a barter system. So with that knowledge in mind, it would be best to not store food. I mean, this has been an idea. It can't hurt to have a bit of food around, but it's not going to last you 50 years or 45 by that point. So what you need is to figure out how to operate like farm, how to grow things. And that's what we're doing here on our farm. We're developing it for a place of safety in the 50 years that are ahead of us. And I'm predicting that by year 5, in like 5 years from now, things will become very chaotic in cities. Only the cities that are righteous will still be functioning. The rest will basically burn down. They'll be trashed by the mobs that Satan works in. Now, I'm getting a whole lot of thoughts going on here. So back to the count. You're never counting the 8th day. That's a day that's set aside, or in our terminology, sometimes it's 2 days, but God always calls it a day, the day of the new moon. It can be either 1 day long, or let's put it this way, it can be either approximately 24 hours long or 48 hours long, approximately, because days are never 24 hours. That's Babylon. Sunset to sunset is always a bit less or a bit more. And then those days that are what we'd call 2 days long, they come from the first sign, which is sunset, to the second sign, which we're waiting for something. In the case of the new moon, we're waiting for the appearance of the first crescent, and that can be just 1 day later or 2 days later. And in this past cycle that just happened last week, a week ago, we had after the 4th Sabbath of that cycle, we had a 1 day new moon. But we didn't know that until we went through it. It could have been a 2 day new moon, which is why we couldn't predict which day that the Feast of Weeks is going to be on. But now we can, because the next new moon cycle actually happens when the Feast of Weeks arrives. And we're not going to count it anyway. And what the Lord says is you count the 7 weeks, which means 6 days, 6 work days, and a Sabbath. It does not include counting the new moon festival. So now we're to the 5th week. Oh, sorry. We're now to the, I'll just go back on this. There was 3. The harvest started on the, just give me 1 sec here. The harvest started on the 15th. That was the great day. Well, first I said the 16th, but remember, Babylon days start and end at midnight, whereas in God's system they start and end at sunset for most days. Virtually all days start at sunset, but some days, the 2 day ones, will go through a 2 day cycle, let's call it, in our Babylonian thinking, before the next sunset. So we call it 2 days. God calls it 1 day. That's God's thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. So back to the 15th, that was the beginning of the count. We'll assume the harvest started then, because I haven't had word from Nehemiah Garden. I suspect that the harvest would start one of 2 weeks, depending on how the year went. So we count the end of the first week was the 22nd on our Babylonian calendar. The second was the 29th. Third was the 6th here of May. So those first two are April. So May is the end of the third week, and then we had the new moon on the 7th, following the 4 Sabbaths. And again, we never know if it's going to be a 1-day new moon or a 2-day until it happens. In this case, it was a 1-day new moon, and the crescent reappeared on the 8th, and we started our 6-day count. But now we've switched to Saturday for the Sabbath. So that's this past week. Yesterday, the 14th, was the end of the 4th week. So now the 21st is going to be the 5th week, 28th will be the 6th week, and then this present cycle of 4 weeks ends on the 4th of June, which completes the count of 49 days. Now, in the rhetoric, God says count 50, so we're counting 50 because you pick the day after that count finishes. And but you haven't counted any new moon festivals in that count. So you've counted 7 full weeks, 50 days, and you're not counting new moon festivals. You never count new moon festivals. They're a day set apart. They represent the new heavens and the new earth, a time that comes after the 7,000-year plan of the Lord. So, Pentecost, I was just going to say, the Feast of Weeks will occur this year on the 5th of June. And then the new cycle, we'll find out, and that's also a new moon day. And the new moon may extend to 2 days. So it could be the 6th, the second day of the new moon, it's possible. And then our new week count will put our Sabbath either on Sunday or Monday. But that doesn't change that the Feast of Weeks will be the 5th. We know that now, because the new moon this past cycle was only 1 day. Now you can well imagine on some years you could be starting your count. Like the harvest could go on a Sabbath where the new moon is the next day, and it could end up 2 days. But you wouldn't count those 2 days. You'd start your count on the first day of the first week after that wave sheaf offering. Anyway, I know this sounds somewhat confusing, but it's not because it is confusing. It's because our paradigms prevent us from getting rid of all that old stuff out of our brain and getting the new stuff fired up. And I know I was explaining it yesterday around the table, the 4 of us, and my wife's heard a lot of this over 8 years, so not so much for her, but Roberta and Ron were, it's kind of, you see them scratching their brain. There's too much information to try and sort it all out, but not because it's difficult. It's because you got all this old junk that we've been taught for 50, 60 years, and it's just really hard to push that stuff out of your brain. That this is the way I used to think, and we got to now start thinking the way God thinks. Anyway, that's enough brain fry for a bit. I also wanted to finish a couple of thoughts. I had talked about the Jubilee year. The belief is that there's a fairly widespread belief, and I'm one of them, that starting on we often say starting on this atonement of this year. Well, it is on atonement of this year. The Sabbath years always end and start, rather than the first day of the year, which is spring. So God has kind of like 2 beginnings of a year, in a sense, and the reason for the second one is you have to have fall to include a crop year, because when you plant your crops in the fall, that's the fall, the winter crops we call them here in Canada. We put winter wheat in. So and rye, winter rye. But in Israel, it's a different climate, and but they do the same thing. They put their winter crops in the fall after the fall feast and everything's done in Israel. Then the farmers go out and seed their crops for the next spring, and they spend a lot of the winter dormant. But as soon as it starts warming up, say January, February, I don't know what it does in Israel, they start growing again, and then by right after the days of unleavened bread, it's ready for harvest. Whereas in Canada here, it works quite differently. You know, we see them in the fall, but the snow comes and buries them, and they really go dormant and don't start growing till spring. They're just a few weeks ahead of our spring crops. So in that way, it's very different in Israel to Canada. So that's a paradigm also. You know, a farmer here in Canada is trying to understand how it works in Israel, and I still have some learning to go. Anyway, I'm getting short of time here. if I'm hitting 7 to 11 minutes, I'm really over. Anyway, the Jubilee year, the common thought is, and I agree, that the Jubilee will start this Day of Atonement this year. But it also means that we are in a Sabbath year right now. The way it works is there's 7 groups of 7 years, and every 7th year in that, making 49, every 7th year is a Sabbath year. It's a year you rest the land, you don't seed, you don't harvest, and you forgive debts on that year. And you go through those 7 cycles of 7, and then the 50th year is the Jubilee, and you don't seed and you don't harvest. So in other words, every 50th year, you got this double land Sabbath idea. And so if next year, starting in the Day of Atonement, this fall, is the Jubilee, that's a rest year, but so is this year a rest year. And my belief is that the Lord will take both crops, and I'm going to say it'll affect the crops worldwide. We're going to have a severe food shortage. Can you well imagine if we have poor crops for 2 years in a row, or crop failures? And going back to what the Lord has said in the Torah, that because of our disobedience, and all mankind has been disobedient, because nobody's been letting their land rest, more or less. There's the odd person, the odd way place. Pat and I rested our land 4 times in the 32 years that we were farming, and but the people before me didn't. But it so happens I got a little chunk of land that's actually rested 18 years. Here in Saskatchewan, our land is behind about 18 years. And I'll do the math on another episode, but we're short 18 Sabbath years. And the Lord says that when all this crisis at the end of the age comes, He's going to make the land keep its Sabbath. Or allow it. He's going to kick us off the land. He's going to cause the birth pangs of the Messiah, the troubled times of the end days, and we will not harvest our crops basically for that 50-year period of time. And the land will enjoy its Sabbath. That's what He says in the Torah. Once we get into our punishment for disobeying Him all these years. Anyway, back to my original thought. This year is a Sabbath year, and next year is a Sabbath year. And I believe that the Lord will give a very poor or not a crop at all for 2 years in a row, and that will lead to a tremendous crisis and shortage of food. Now, did I finish this thought? I also wanted to, I want to throw in this thought too. So we talked quite a bit about how the new moon can be 1 day or 2 days. Well, so can what I call the corners of the year. There's in Enoch's calendar, you count 90, and then you stop, and God calls it a day, but it turns out what He means in our terminology, it's either a 24-hour period or a 48-hour period. So we waiting for the next sign, and the next sign may show itself a day later or 2 days later. So it's the same as the New Moon Festival. We never know if these 4 corners of the year, at the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices, Summer and winter, we never know until they actually happen, whether they're going to be 1 day long or 2 days long. So planning a calendar ahead is not going to work because of those two variables that are always there. And then the Feast of Weeks has a third variable. We have to wait till the harvest starts, and the farmers know when that is. Anyway, I'm past 30 minutes. Signing off. Neil Buchanan with Rock Our World.